Furthermore, Greece can default, as they have for 50% of their history, and not take down the world economy. Indonesia didn't take it down in 2002. Russia didn't take it down in 98. Argentina defaults every 6 months, and they haven't taken the economy down. And so we can actually sustain it. So in my judgment, the day of reckoning for Greece is not the day of reckoning for the world. We've got that wrong. Reports of Greece mattering are greatly exaggerated. What does matter are European banks. And the European banks, frankly, don't look that dissimilar to the US banks prior to the financial crisis. If you remember when we went through that exercise in 2009, which was no fun, we talked about how US banks were levered 30 to 40 times. Well, we've gotten them under control. They're now only levered 9 to 11 times in this example. By the way, that's Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America. In Europe, the banks, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, and BNP Paribas, are levered 20 to 30 times. And so they are vulnerable. If you look at it systematically, the US economy and Europe's economy are basically about the same size. Total bank assets in the US, 12 trillion. Total bank assets in the Eurozone, 46 trillion. So they're carrying 4 times the amount of assets on their books, which obviously correlates with their low capitalization levels. And so they are vulnerable. What do you do about it? Well, you get rid of the worst central banker in history, Jean-Claude Trichet, and you invite an Italian, pragmatic central banker in. This is Mario Draghi. And he turns on the liquidity hoses. And so last year, in the middle of in the third quarter, you might remember us saying, okay, there's nothing that can happen here except for the European Central Bank to print. And that precipitated our decisions to get more aggressive. Well, they have been printing. They've been printing a lot. They're not admitting it, but it is occurring. And so what you're seeing here is the amount of monetary easing that's going on in Europe relative to the US and the UK. You can see the spike up. And then they lent a whole bunch of money to banks, right? They solved the liquidity problem, and they bought a bunch of toxic assets. And so the European Central Bank has washed enough liquidity over the banks that they've foregone any risk of a huge blow-up. If you remember, the reason Lehman went under was not because it was sour. I mean, it was, but it was because nobody would give them any more money. They couldn't make payroll, and so they were gone. That is not going to happen in a bank in Europe. Now, that's the liquidity side of the question. What about the solvency side of the question? Well, for that, we need to look at growth. And again, the assumption the press has made is that if European growth slows down, we're all going to die. The reality is Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal together account for 5% of global GDP. Just to put this in perspective, the Greek economy is the size of Maryland, which makes Portugal probably Rhode Island. Right? I mean, they're not going to take us down, and Italy and Spain, while contracting, are in better position than Greece or Portugal. And so they're not going to pull down the world economy. But don't point fingers at the Europeans. Okay? Here's why. Remember this chart? Ready? That's where the US is. Okay? And so we're having all these discussions about Portugal, here's Spain, there's France, we downgraded them, here's Italy. The US is down here, more akin to Greece. Here is the current federal budget of the US. It's $3.6 trillion. Of that $3.6 trillion, tax revenue provides, and fines and penalties, $2.3 trillion. And then we borrow the remainder, which is about 40%. So we borrow 40% of every dollar we spend. Tax revenue actually just covers defense and entitlements. Everything else we borrow the money for. And it doesn't look like our pattern is changing at all. In fact, we just got Obama's budget the other day, and it calls for yet another $1 trillion deficit, which I think is the 5th in the row or something. And if you extrapolate it out, $1 trillion deficits look to be the norm at this point. And so let's translate the government's math to households' math. If the government was a household, they would make $250,000 a year. They would spend $400,000 a year, which means they'd have to borrow $150,000 a year. And by the way, their accumulated debt at this point would amount to $1.7 million. Now, do we have any bankers in the room? Would anybody loan these people money? The answer is absolutely not.